So, good morning, everybody. I'm Gottfried Hagen. I'm the director of the Center for Armenian Studies here at the University of Michigan. I'm also a professor of Turkish studies in the Department of Middle East Studies. And it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody here to today's workshop and to the center. I wanted to say a few words about the center before I turn everything over to Hazal to introduce workshop and our speakers. So Armenian Studies here at Michigan is very much a community-driven, community-supported enterprise. It's kind of the famous three-legged stool of consisting of two endowed professorships, one in history, one in Middle East studies. And the third leg is the center, which also mostly is funded by external donors, most prominently the Manoukian Simon Foundation, which also is behind the two chairs. And we're grateful for making this possible. We do a lot of programming. We support teaching, lectures, and so. And one of the sort of most fun things to do for us is to host two postdoctoral fellows here and to see new work, new research, new faces, new minds coming in. And so part of the postdoc program here is that each of them gets to do a workshop specifically around their work. So today is Hazal's term, and we're looking forward to also having Bogdan Pavlish in a couple of weeks. And so I said we're very much sort of supported by outside funds, but I would be remiss if I wouldn't thank our also internal supporters, the College of Language Sciences and the Arts, the Institute for the Humanities. And am I missing somebody? Probably. And of course, grateful for local work. Viken here, who's running the show behind the scenes. Thanks for making it work. And so without further ado, I would like to invite Hazal up here to introduce the workshop and the program for today. Thanks.
Thank you. Hey. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to see all of you here. I'm Hazal Özdemir, the Manoukian Postdoctoral Fellow in Armenian Studies, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all here. It has been a dream for me to bring you all to Ann Arbor during the Ice Age. I'm sorry for that, but it has been better in the last couple of days. And my special thanks goes to Gottfried Hagen and Viken Muradian for materializing this dream. I want to thank Gottfried for his support along the way for this overseas conference. And Viken, you know you're the best. And thank you so much for all the wonderful organization and dealing with all the bits and pieces. I'm thankful for the Center for Armenian Studies, the College of Literature, Arts and Science, and the Institute of Humanities, the Office of the Vice President for Research, in addition to the Manoukian Foundation. I'm very glad Jessica Marglin with us. I'm thankful to Davy, Julia, Melanie, and Gottfried for accepting to be our discussants and chairs. And I'm so happy to see familiar faces and meet people whom I only contacted via email, but admire their work. And I have presented my work on Armenian mobility and denaturalization at many conferences, but I feel that whenever I started to talk about subjecthood and the practice of denaturalization, I started to lose people. They were not interested anymore. They were like, give us the photographs, like we don't care. And I was waiting for this day to come so that people interested in subjecthood, citizenship, and belonging in the Ottoman and post-Ottoman world could come together and discuss. And I'm so excited to discuss like very exciting topics such as, did it differ to be an Ottoman in the Gulf, in the Ottoman East, Bosnia, or in Istanbul? What did subjecthood mean to the Greek, Armenian, Jewish, Iraqi, and Italian communities of the empire and its post-successor states? Did it mean like acquiring property or imperial integration and negotiation, military service, service to the state? How the other identifications impacted imperial belonging, such as being Jewish, Muslim, Armenian, or Arab? Can you be an Armenian and Ottoman at the same time? Or how did Mediterranean subjects choose between affiliations or simply left without a choice? What is the right terminology to use? Like, I'm still struggling with it. Like nationality, naturalization, denaturalization, renouncing subjecthood. And like, what are the changing parameters of foreignness and belonging in the Turkish Republic? I'm very excited. So without further ado, let me introduce our keynote speaker. Jessica Marglin is a professor of religion, law, and history and the Ruth Ziegler Chair in Jewish Studies at the University of Southern California. She earned her PhD from Princeton and her BA and MA from Harvard. Her research focuses on the history of Jews and Muslims in North Africa and the Mediterranean, with a particular emphasis on law. She is the author of Across Legal Lines, Jews and Muslims in Modern Morocco, which came from Yale University Press in 2016, and the Shammameh Case, Contesting Citizenship Across the Modern Mediterranean, Princeton University Press, 2022. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Is that, yeah, good enough? Yes, can everybody hear me? Hi. First of all, thank you so much, Hazal, for organizing this. As I get further along in my career, I get more and more thankful to other people who take the time to organize really interesting meetings so I can just show up and talk and I don't have to do all of the incredible amounts of legwork to make this happen. So I really, really appreciate it. And thank you also to Vicken for being an amazing, just all the logistics have been super easy. And thank you, all of you, for sharing your papers. I'm so excited for the whole day. What I'm going to speak about today is really, well, first of all, I didn't actually, I just kind of sprung this on Hazal. I originally thought, oh, yeah, I'll speak about 19th century. That's my century, you know, what works perfectly. But as I've gotten deeper into the research for this new book that I'm working on, which is a sort of connective history of extraterritoriality as it emerged over the 18th century to the 19th century, I realized that actually the 18th century is incredibly important. So I'm going to take you all back. And then, but the early modernist is like, yay. No, but actually I'm still interested in the 19th century, but I think that what I've become convinced of is that the 1830s and 40s are the decades of most excitement for the changing nature of extraterritoriality. So that's largely what I'm going to talk about as it pertains to subjecthood and blogging. Okay, this is how I advance. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to start with a couple stories of Maltese behaving badly in North Africa. So first, in Tripoli, present-day Libya, 1843, a Maltese man named Giovanni Battista Caruana Lanzon, known as just as Battista, was accused of murdering a Jewish man, Saja Borgega. It seems like actually Battista was angry at a Jewish woman whose name is Hester in the documents, but it's probably Esther, who was, quote, in the habit of pawning things for Battista's grandmother. And on quitting the grandmother's house, Battista pursued her with a knife in his hand, saying, "This day I will drink your blood." Maltese said things like that a lot, you'd be surprised. Borgega saw Esther's distress, ran after his fellow Jew, Borgega saw Esther's distress, ran after Battista. Battista hit Borgega. Borgega hit him back, and then Battista pulls out his knife and stabs him to death right there in the street. And as he's dying, Borgega exclaimed, quote, "All the people will be witness of this deed," and he fell down and died. So as a Maltese, Battista is under the jurisdiction of the British consul, because, right, Malta is a British colony after, well, certainly after the Napoleonic Wars. And according to the capitulations, British subjects accused of killing an Ottoman subject, Borgega was an Ottoman subject, would be tried in an Ottoman court. Like, that was pretty clear in the text. And the British consul clearly has a little bit of discomfort with this, and he sort of weakly says to the Pasha, maybe we could try him in our court, do you mind? And the Pasha's like, absolutely not. This was a public crime committed against an Ottoman subject. He's getting tried in Ottoman court. British guy is like, fine. And it sends this long letter to the Secretary of State in London, justifying his actions and saying, otherwise I would have sanctioned murder. And after the trial, the British consul does attend the trial, right, which is his right as sort of having this partial jurisdiction over the Maltese. And he says, we hereby state that all the proceedings of the Divan, that is the Divan of the Pasha, have been conducted with solemnity, impartiality, and deliberation, and in our presence, conformable to Turkish Treaty, Article 42, and Tripoli Treaty, Article 12. A few weeks later, a little bit further west, a Maltese man named Paolo Huereb committed a double murder in Tunis. As the Bey of Tunis put it in his letter to the British consul announcing the crime, our subject, literally Wulduna, our son, Yusuf, one of those appointed to guard the British consulate, was shot, and explains that a deterrent ruling must be issued. As a subject of the Bey of Tunis, which is the language used by the British consulate, Yusuf's murder again falls under the jurisdiction of the Bey because it refers to the same sort of Ottoman treaties and then a specific Tunisian treaty, which has the same clauses as the one for the first murder. But this time, the other consuls and the Maltese population in Tunis, which is very large at this point, it's at least 4,000 people, get very upset about the idea of a Christian man being tried in the Pasha's court, in the Bey's court. And so for months, there are bitter protests. The Maltese paste these very incendiary broadsides all over the city in Italian. And the Bey is like, what's up, guys? You got to rein in your people. But then also the consuls send these angry letters. All of the other consuls, except the American consul, send these angry letters to the British consul saying, how could you do this? This is terrible. They object that a Christian would be tried in an Islamic court for all of the kind of, Orientalist prejudicial reasons that you can probably imagine. But they also, at one point, again, rather weakly, sort of suggest that Yusuf, did I say this? Yusuf was working as a, quote, dragoman, as a guard for the British consulate. So they suggest that as somebody working for the British consulate, he actually should have protege status and should not be tried in an Ottoman court. He should be tried in the British consular court anyway. In other words, not just because Huereb was a Christian, but because the victim could be considered a protege. But the consul is very clear. And again, there's an enormous, this case is a much bigger case than the first case in Tripoli. So there's an enormous amount of correspondence. And the Secretary of State in London is also very clear. No, this falls under Tunisian jurisdiction, right? The Bey of Tunis definitely has jurisdiction over that. And I think, sort of what to me is really important is that this is a turning point where on the one hand, the religion of the subjects killed is never raised. The fact that the first time it's a Jew and the second time it's a Muslim, nobody seems to really note that or care. And it barely registers that Yusuf, the dragoman who was killed in Tunis, might have qualified as a protege, right? That's kind of not really on anybody's radar in a serious way. And so what I want to argue is that these cases, both in 1843, 1844, occur when the connotations of being Ottoman and the power of consular protection were in the midst of changing and transforming. And I think that the importance of religion and protection, consular protection, really start to radically transform after starting around this period, not only for the consuls, but also for Ottoman authorities. Okay, so what I want to talk about today, and I should say that this is very completely brand new work. I have not spoken about these ideas to anybody else. So I'm very excited and also very eager for your honest feedback and criticism because it will very much help me as I'm trying to figure out what this book is about. So I want to start with sort of how I'm thinking about the historiography of citizenship in the Ottoman Empire in the transition from the early modern to the modern. And I will talk a little bit about legal belonging, this idea that I talk about in my last book. And then I want to spend most of the time actually talking about what seems to me that legal belonging looks like in the early modern period, and how subjecthood completely trumps protection. Consular protection is extremely weak, including for Catholics, Catholic religious in particular. And then I want to talk about sort of the shift, and particularly the beginning of mass extension of consular protection to Muslims in the 19th century, and how that seems to signal part of a shift in the thinking about subjecthood. Okay. So the standard narrative of historiography of Ottoman citizenship, thinking really particularly about the term citizenship or nationality, and this is I'm painting with very broad strokes here, but the way I see it is that it's generally seen as a Tanzimat creation. It's seen as something that comes about post 1839 and then, crystallizes the nationality law, but that the sort of abolition of Zimmi status in 1856 and the mostly full equality of non-Muslims is a big part of this, right? That now everybody's Ottoman. It doesn't matter if you're Christian or Armenian or Jewish or whatever. And so, I'm thinking about the work of Shukri Haniolu and his book on the late Ottoman Empire, where he says that the Hati Sharif of Gulhane is the main first step towards the transformation of hitherto Muslim, Christian, and Jewish subjects into Ottomans, right? And then also that really very interesting article by Ariel Salzman, Citizens in Search of a State, but which also I think very much thinks of citizenship as something that is invented in the 19th century, right? And then, of course, as we know, and now we're getting into the period that is much more all of your specialty than mine, but in the Hamidian period, and then especially under the Young Turks, being Ottoman comes to increasingly be associated with being Muslim and Turkish, right? And then that kind of, certainly from what I've read of the papers, that culminates in the Turkish Republic, right? So very quickly, right, I think a lot of the historiography too about sort of Islamic sovereignty and belonging is about the idea that Muslims are the only ones that can be thought of as citizens because of the disabilities of dhimmi status. And this is what I think needs to change. This is the narrative that I'm challenging. So part of what I have been thinking about for a long time is moving away from terms like citizenship and nationality and towards this idea of legal belonging. And I'm not going to spend a long time talking about legal belonging. I don't know, Hazal, if that's what you wanted me to spend all my time talking about, but I'm hoping that some of you have read my work on this. And but I'll just say very quickly that, basically I think that citizenship is problematic when you're looking at the Ottoman case because it has so much European baggage, because it's so hard to disassociate it from the kind of democratic rights. And I really love Will Hanley's work moving towards nationality, but nationality really just doesn't work for the 18th century or even the early 19th century because nobody's using the term. It's not a term that means what it comes to mean in the later 19th century. And I find it too confusing to use a term that comes with a lot of later baggage for an earlier period. So I've moved away from nationality. And legal belonging, I think of as many different ways of belonging to a state, but at a legal level. So I'm not talking about cultural belonging. I'm not talking about feelings of like, I like the Ottomans or I like being Ottoman, or I identify as Ottoman. It's really about the kind of rights and privileges and duties and the rights and privileges and duties of the state. So both ways. And so it can exist along a spectrum. Like there are weak ways to belong to a state, like consular protection. You're not actually even considered a subject, but you do have certain rights vis-a-vis the consulate that's protecting you, and you have certain duties vis-a-vis the consulate that's protecting you. But then, of course, there's a much stronger version, which involves more what we could call kind of political rights and civil rights. But the other thing that I think is particularly important for my work now is that belonging can be layered. Legal belonging is not, so again, I think part of the difficulty with the historiography is that people talk about dual nationality or dual citizenship, but that first of all, that's not really most of the early modern and even well into the 19th century and even well into the 20th century, most states reject on principle the possibility of dual nationality or dual citizenship. And if it happens, it's like an abomination or an aberration. But belonging gets layered all the time. Again, consular protection. You are a subject of the Ottoman Empire and you are protected by the French consulate, and thus you legally belong to both in some ways. And again, this fits into, I imagine you're all familiar somewhat with the discussion about the kind of recent historiography on sovereignty. Sovereignty as not one simple thing with beautiful borders on a map that is even, but rather it's lumpy. So I'm thinking of Lauren Benton here. It's often layered or divided, right? I'm thinking of Mary Lewis. Anyway, again, I want to try to remain brief. So part of the kind of, I think, helpful possibilities of moving away from citizenship and nationality and towards legal belonging is that it becomes so clear in the sources, for me, once you use this lens, that legal belonging is an absolutely central factor in shaping political and legal spheres long before the Tanzimat, that legal belonging absolutely exists in the Ottoman Empire. It has nothing to do with being Muslim or not. Well, nothing. I mean, yes, your legal belonging is inflected by your religion, but you are absolutely, the possibility of legally belonging to the Ottoman Empire is not at all restricted to Muslims, not in the slightest. That is not how Ottoman authorities are thinking of it, and that is also not how European authorities are thinking of it. The consuls do not think in those terms. That only comes later. So the Tanzimat does not invent citizenship or nationality. It just actually changes it, and it's only much later that we have this association. And in some ways, I think that this association with citizenship as a Muslim-only thing, ironically, comes from Europe. And this is something. There's more to be done on this idea, but it's become fascinating to me the ways in which European jurists writing about law in the Ottoman Empire, which they're often doing through the lens of the capitulations, really take the European model of citizenship and kind of try to juxtapose it on the Ottoman Empire. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this book, Bélissier de Rosas, published 2 volumes between 1902 and 1905. I think it's kind of the most complete legal study of extraterritoriality. And he says that there is no difference between the legal idea and the religious idea in the Ottoman Empire. The Quran is both a civil and religious code, and thus the foreigner, that is to say the non-Muslims, so he's assimilating foreigners and non-Muslims, is outside of religion. So for him, even a non-Muslim subject of the Sultan is not within the civil code of the Ottoman Empire because it is inherently religious. There's a lot more to say about this view, and we can talk about it, but I'm really just raising this to talk about the ways in which I think starting in the 19th century and lasting well through the 20th century, jurists projected their understanding of European citizenship onto what was going on in the Ottoman Empire. So because Jews could never get citizenship in early modern Europe, because there was a kind of link between citizenship and Christianity, they assumed that the same thing was going on in the Ottoman Empire. Since 2000, the historiography on citizenship in Europe and European empires has changed enormously. And I've been incredibly influenced by the work of people like Tamar Herzog, Simona Cerutti, who have worked on basically saying that, yes, non-Christians were often excluded from formal versions of citizenship, but this does not mean that they were excluded from all versions of citizenship. And they were certainly part of this broader vision of legal belonging. And they absolutely belonged. They claimed rights. They had duties. Sovereignty was exercised over them, and they felt like they legally belonged to these states. And I think increasingly also now in Ottoman historiography, so not just Will Hanley, but Lale Jan's work on spiritual subjecthood, right? I think there's been an enormous amount of new ways of thinking about how sovereignty and belonging work in the Ottoman Empire. So this is kind of the historiography that I'm trying to intervene in. And what I want to do is spend most of the time talking about how I see consular protection working or non-working, basically the sort of relationship between being an Ottoman of the subject and having being a subject of the Ottoman Empire and having consular protection in the 18th century, to highlight what feels to me like a complete revolution in the early 19th century. Okay, Next slide. Do I need to go there yet? Okay, wait. Yeah, no, not quite. Okay, we'll stay on this for a little bit. Okay, so I think that there's often, especially in the historiography of extraterritoriality, there's so much privileging of the 19th century that, again, I think there's a lot of projecting back onto the early modern period what is actually a late 19th century state of affairs. And especially when people sort of talk about the capitulations, they talk about them as, they kind of assimilate protection and foreign subjecthood. So if you are, they talk about if you are a foreign subject or a foreign protege, then you have certain jurisdictional rights, you have certain fiscal privileges, you don't have certain duties to the Ottoman Sultan, et cetera, et cetera. But what has really honestly shocked me as I've been looking at the consular correspondence from the 18th century is that that seems to be completely false, that in fact, consular protection basically did nothing if you were, not nothing, it did very little if you were a subject of the Sultan, and what mattered was your subjecthood, your legal belonging. And consular protection was like a nice kind of thing to have maybe, but I think it was mostly about fiscal privileges and very little about jurisdictional privileges. I will say that I'm still very much in the midst of my research, and so far, because I'm based in Paris, I've mainly looked at French correspondence. It also happens to be extremely extensive and very well inventoried. So, but I need to look at other non-French sources as well. But you will see that today's talk is heavily French, even though I think that's not the way I want the book to be eventually. Okay, so let's just look. I mean, oh wait, no, I don't have a slide for this. So there are just so many instances of proteges being subject to the jurisdiction of Ottoman authorities over and over and over again. I'll just give an example. In 1711, the dragoman, the interpreter for the French consulate in Istanbul, is punished. Oh no, sorry, not in Istanbul, in Smyrna, in Izmir. His name is Torby. He's a Maronite, but an Ottoman subject. And he is struck 200 times with a stick by the Pasha, which is actually a retribution for the bad behavior of a French merchant who was in a dispute with an Ottoman Jewish merchant who pulled his beard and slapped the Jewish merchant around. And the Pasha was like, absolutely not. But then it turned out that the Pasha kind of had it out for Torby, the dragoman, as well, because then what's interesting is that the ambassador, the French ambassador, gets wind of this trouble, that Torby, the dragoman, has been beaten. He's like, you really shouldn't beat the dragoman. They're under our protection. That's not a good look. And he gets a commandment from an irade from the Grand Vizier saying, don't do that. But, or please don't do that, basically. And but by the time it gets to Smyrna, by the time it gets to Izmir, it's too late because the Pasha has already exiled Torby to another island, saying that he's a character of mauvaise vie. He's like a bad guy. And honestly, the French ambassador is like, you know what? It's not such a bad thing because he was not a Frenchman, and it's better that we're not going to be able to effectively protect him. So maybe it's not so bad that he go off and we replace him with Frenchman. And I don't know if you know this, but the French at one point create a language school to train French subjects to be dragomans, much on the model of the Venetian school. Scuola di Giovanni, I think it's called.
École des jeunes de langue.
That's in French, but I think
Giovanni di Lingua.
Giovanni di Lingua, grazie, yeah. So and they don't succeed in completely Frenchifying the corpse of dragoman because they can't, but they are very aware of this, and that the creation of that École des jeunes langues, the how do we translate that? The school of language for young ones, I suppose, or the language school for French dragoman, is very much a response to the inability to protect Ottoman subjects. There are many other examples, but I won't get them. This precarity of Ottoman protection extends not just to dragoman, we might think are kind of a little bit sort of in between, but also to Ottoman subjects appointed as consuls. And I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Mathieu Grenet, who has done an enormous amount of work and just wrote a kind of second dissertation, which you have to do in France, on the French consular service in the Eastern Mediterranean is fabulous. And he has a lot of work on the appointment of Ottoman Greeks, Orthodox Christians, Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians, as consuls and vice consuls. And again, what his work says, and what I've found in the archives, is that these consuls, even though by virtue of being appointed as a French consul, get consular protection, they do not have the same immunity from Ottoman jurisdiction that Frenchmen do. They are really considered still very much to be Ottoman subjects. So again, one example, in 1727, the French ambassador writes to Paris complaining about Antoine Guizy, who is the consul of Tinos and Mykonos, two islands in the archipelago, and says, he's not doing a great job, but really more seriously, given that he is a subject of the Sultan, he can only be considered to offer weak support. And he says, let's replace him with a Frenchman if we can. And they do. Again, this all changes by the 19th century. And by the time that Pélissier de Rosas is writing, right, he notes that there is basically an assimilation of the legal condition of protégés to the legal condition of foreign nationals, with the only difference that protégés remain under their kind of respective religious jurisdictions for matters of personal status. So for Pélissier de Rosas, right, a protégé has all of the same advantages, except, of course, it's not supposed to be heritable. It's not supposed to continue after your employment as a dragoman, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea is that, it is basically the same status. And I think, well, it's the subject of another lecture to talk about exactly how this happened. But my point is just that there's a major transformation between the 18th century, when clearly everybody concerned agreed that being an Ottoman subject mattered more than having Ottoman protection, to 1902, when Pélissier de Rosas kind of blithely says, yes, protégés have the same status, and where that is indeed what you see in the archives. Okay, the other topic that I want to talk about, which I also find just super compelling, is the question of the status of Catholic religious in the Ottoman Empire. Religious meaning nuns and priests and monks. So again, in the kind of standard historiography, there's a very clear sense that Catholic religious are eligible to be under French protection. They might also invoke the protection if they're foreign nationals and they have let's say they're Sardinian, they can invoke the Sardinian consul's protection or whatever, but that they certainly are entitled to French protection, whatever their nationality. First, I think it's important to say that from the Ottoman perspective, there's clearly a difference between Catholic religious of foreign nationality and Catholic religious who are subjects of the Sultan. And this you see very clearly in the Ahadnameh, in the capitulation with France of 1673, where there's a distinction between French subjects and non-French subjects. But I think the thing that really kind of, again, really surprised me looking at the archives is that for French consuls, there is an enormous difference between Catholic religious who are subjects of the Sultan, who are under a kind of, even I would say, again, if we're thinking about even consular protection as existing along a spectrum of belonging, they have an even weaker claim to consular protection than, say, dragoman, or certainly than vice consuls and consuls. But basically, what becomes clear is that the French ambassadors and consuls intervening on behalf of Catholic religious who are Ottoman subjects do so in a completely unofficial manner. They're basically saying, yeah, we have no real right, we have no actual jurisdiction over them, but we'd like to help them out. And Chios becomes a sort of center of this, because Chios, maybe you all know this, but Chios is one island that has a large indigenous Catholic population from what, not a product of missionizing, right? And then especially in the late 17th century, it's briefly under Venetian rule. There's another Venetian-Ottoman war, and for 6 months, the Venetians rule it, and then the Ottomans take it back, and they destroy a bunch of Catholic churches. So then there's this years and years during which the French consuls and the ambassador tried to help the Catholic rebuild. Okay, wait, here we go. So first, what's interesting is that there's a report that the Capucin, there are 3 orders: the Capucins, the Jesuits, and the Order of the Terre Sainte, I think. No, the Dominicans. Sorry, on Chios, it's the Dominicans. And first, that we read that the Capucins have actually, after the reconquest, they left completely, because they, in fact, were Frenchmen. They were French priests, or I guess monks, who had been sent, but they were worried about being conflated with Ottoman subjects and treated very badly. So they were just like, we're getting out of here. And then eventually they could come back. 25 years later, there's still an attempt to rebuild, and the Catholic priests, the Catholic religious of Chios once again turn to the French ambassador for help. And the French ambassador agrees to intercede on their behalf of the Grand Vizier. And he says that he really shouldn't be doing this as one big request, because in fact, there are some of the orders who are French, or rather Frankish Europeans. And then there are some who are Ottoman subjects and just happen to be Catholic religious. And he really doesn't have a right to intervene on their behalf. He does it anyway. But he sort of says that, in fact, they are rayas, or subject of the Sultan. This makes their case different. And it doesn't work that well, because he does intervene with the Grand Vizier. He does intervene with the Grand Vizier. The Grand Vizier, again, gives an irada that's kind of a little bit weak sauce. But then mostly he seems to have trouble with the Catholic religious themselves, who get like a vague permission to rebuild the consular chapel and instead build a big church. And the ambassador is livid, because he says he had told them, I'm quoting, stridently about the danger of their actions, but who can restrain people who are always talking about the glory of God? And indeed, the Ottoman authorities are furious at the building of this giant church, even though nobody gave them permission to do this. The ambassador at one point gets really worried that the Ottomans are just going to destroy the entire consulate, which would be bad, both, financially, but also very bad look, right? It's a really bad look to have your whole consulate. And indeed, just a few years earlier, the English consulate on Chios had been completely destroyed, sort of for similar reasons. So he's really angry at the religious. And finally, the solution is that they have to pay an enormous fine, 40,000 écus, which is a French denomination. But it's really like an astronomical sum of money. And the ambassador's like, yeah, that's going to be really tough for them to come up with, but they're going to have to do it, because like they've behaved so badly, and they are Ottoman subject and they don't have a choice. Okay. When should I end? Somebody remind me of how much time we have.
Back.
Right.
11, 13, yeah, I guess the first panel.
Okay, so we should.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a little bit longer.
Yeah, actually.
By 11:15, we should end the discussion.
Yes.
Okay, so I want to leave plenty of time for discussion. Okay, good.
Maybe
Great. Okay, perfect. Good. Oh, that's plenty of time. Great. Okay. There's also again, so the Chios is a recurring problem, and there's an enormous amount of correspondence in the consular records. There's also an enormous amount of correspondence about Damascus. Well, generally, actually not just Damascus, but about French missionaries, especially the Jesuits, and about their rights vis-a-vis Ottoman subjects, because there's essentially a kind of open question about how much authority Catholic missionaries have to proselytize among Ottoman Christians. Nobody's talking about Muslims, of course, but there's also a lot of anxiety and sort of competition between various actors over how much access to Ottoman Christians French missionaries should have. And a lot of the problem comes not from Ottoman Muslim authorities, but from Eastern Christian leaders themselves. So the Greek Patriarch and the Armenian Patriarch in particular are extremely worried about all of these Orthodox and Armenian Christians who are converting to Catholicism and thus sort of escaping their authority. And a lot of this is also something I want to look more into. And if you all have reading suggestions, I would welcome them, especially for the Armenian stuff, because that's not my forte. But of course, some of it is jurisdictional, and a lot of it is financial, because of course you're paying taxes. There are certain kind of expectations, and there's an enormous amount of authority being exercised centrally in these churches that once you convert to Catholicism, it seems people largely escape. And one of the recurring questions is, do French Catholic missionaries have the right to go to the houses of Ottoman Christians, Ottoman subjects who are Christians? And repeatedly, again and again, the French ambassadors say, no, you cannot go to Ottoman Christians' houses. The capitulations say you can do your thing in your house, and if they come to you, that's okay, but you cannot go to their houses. And again, irade after irade gets promulgated over the decades saying, no, you can't go to the houses, no, you can't go to the houses. But again, these people who are always talking of God are unruly, and the missionaries are constantly getting themselves in trouble, and thus getting the ambassador in trouble with the Ottoman authorities. So there's a big thing that happens in Damascus in 1725, which sort of, emerges into the archives with the imprisonment of 2 Jesuit priests who are French subjects. So this is considered a clear violation of the capitulations, right? Whereas people kind of expect that an Ottoman subject with French protection is going to get beat up, is going to get exiled, is going to get imprisoned. They might protest, but they're not surprised. There's a sense that if you are a Frenchman, if you have French, if you legally belong to France, you're not supposed to do that. And it turns out that it all begins with a complaint that the Pasha of Damascus was actually acting on orders that begin with a complaint from the Greek patriarch in Istanbul to the Grand Vizier, who then sends orders to the Pasha saying, these guys are overstepping. And one of the other things that I find really interesting and that I want to look more into is that again and again, the Ottomans are anxious about this idea that the converts, the Ottoman subjects who are converting to Catholicism, will become, quote, subjects of the Pope. This is a phrase that recurs again and again, that Catholics will become subjects of the Pope. And the Greek patriarch is also worried about this. So there are long discussions, certainly in Damascus, but actually the negotiations move to Istanbul, where the ambassador is caught up in these conversations with the Reis al-Kutab, the Terjuman Bashi, and eventually he meets with the patriarch himself. And there's an amazing report of his discussion, which I'll just say a little bit about. And the patriarch is upset, and he accuses the French missionaries of filling the heads of those with rather weak minds who allow themselves to be seduced by fear and by the picture they paint of hell. He accuses the French missionaries of sowing discord between husbands and wives, of going to the houses of Orthodox Christians while the husbands are away and converting the women, like seducing. He uses that term, seducing. I think he doesn't mean sexually. I think he maybe means sexually, but I think he means like seducing them to Catholicism. And basically he says, stop. You have to make the missionaries stop going to the Ottoman houses, and you cannot allow the missionaries to accept Ottoman Greek kids, Orthodox Greek kids into their school, because they've created a school and there are lots of Orthodox Greeks who are sending their kids there. And he says, look, why don't you go missionize among the Armenians, the Nestorians, the Copts, the Maronites, and others, and leave the Greeks alone as we think of ourselves as equally Orthodox as the Latins. So there's an interesting also kind of question about what it means to be Orthodox. And even though the ambassador, again, kind of protests and says, you're preventing our missionaries from doing their work. They just want to be there as a resource, right? They're really trying their best. But basically, he completely accedes to all of the demands of the patriarch. He just completely crumbles. And again, this is not that surprising because he has already issued order after order saying, stop going to the houses of Ottoman subjects, right? This is a recurring sort of problem. And at the end, the sort of report says that the visit finished with sorbet and perfumes and many demonstrations of reciprocal esteem, and both sides desire to live together peaceably. So I kind of love it. You can imagine this French ambassador. Yeah, it's like, oh, I love you so much, Greek. And the thing that I think, again, so much of what I'm doing today is giving you kind of the backstory, because for me, this was really honestly surprising. This is not, I didn't expect to find, I kind of had a hunch, and that's why I was looking at the 18th century records, but I was shocked at just over and over again, the reaffirmation of the lack of power to protect Ottoman subjects. And as late as 1827, their French diplomats are kind of writing reports about the status of Ottoman Catholics who are Ottoman subjects. And they say bishops who are subject to the Sultan, we can unofficially protect them, but we have no actual jurisdiction over them. They are zimmis and they pay the jizya, they pay the haraj. They don't have foreign protection consular protection in the way that we think about it. And again, the status of Catholic religious is something that I haven't yet worked on as much. Like for the question of murder and jurisdiction, I have a better sense of how that changes in the 1830s and the 1840s. All that I know is that sometime after 1827, there's a big shift in how consular authorities start to think about their rights over Catholic religious. But stay posted in the next 5 to 10 years, and hopefully I'll have a whole book to say more about it. No, hopefully I'll have a talk about it sooner than that. Okay. Now I want to sort of third part of my talk, because of course it's in 3 parts, 3 parties, as the French like to have it. I want to talk about the question of protection of Muslims, the consular protection of Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. And here we're really now it's really mostly a 19th century story, because it is very rare. I have never found a case where you have European consuls employing Muslims as dragomans before the 19th century, or as like the censal, the censo, the sort of brokers, the intermediaries, who also get consular protection. Now, of course, Ottoman Muslim subjects do work as janissaries, as like basically the soldiers guarding the consulates, and you saw that a little bit in the Tunisian murder case, right? There is a sense that that could be used to claim consular protection. It never seems to have been used before the 19th century for Muslims, right? The Muslims working as janissaries or the Mamluks in Tunisia or whatever, there never seems to be a kind of activation of the possibility of claiming them as protégés. What I did find is some evidence that French ambassadors give French passports to Turks who have to travel through Malta, basically so that they don't get enslaved. And these are passports, again, I imagine this is not news, but I'll say it just in case, right? Passports even into the late 19th century are not identity documents. They act more like visas, and they can be given by somebody who isn't actually by an authority to whom you don't legally belong. So presumably these are Ottoman Muslims who are doing trade on French ships and with French merchants who need to pass through Malta, and who are like, look, they come to the embassy and they're like, I'm going to get enslaved if I have to go here. Can you help me out? And he's like, sure. And actually, this comes up in this context of a whole discussion about the subjecthood of a French Jew, a Sephardic Jew from Bayeux who gets enslaved. And anyway, but so also something I want to look into more. But basically, it seems like until the early 19th century, it was extremely rare for any Ottoman Muslim to claim the status of protégé. As far as I can tell, that really changes after 1830, where immediately, literally, not a month after the French landing in Algiers, you get a sprinkling of Algerian Muslims and a larger sprinkling of Algerian Jews who start approaching the French consuls in Ottoman Syria, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Morocco, and saying, hey, I'm from Algeria. Algeria is now under French control. Can you please be my consul? Can I be your protege? And that's something that I'll talk about a little bit more. And I actually think that that's a huge watershed for the question of protection and extraterritoriality, because suddenly there's this a lot of former Ottoman subjects who are now being claimed as extraterritorial subjects all over. And I'll speak about this later, but there's some excellent new work done on this by Salma Hargal, who's a young scholar, just got a job at Sciences Po Lyon, and watch out for her book. It's going to be great. Okay. At the same time, there's also, I think for the first time, I found instances in which those janissaries, Muslim janissaries working for consulates, do claim extraterritoriality. So in 1835, when Ottoman Syria is under Egyptian occupation, the Egyptians are very good at conscripting people. They're a very efficient conscription machine, and they extend that conscription machine to Syria. And there are a whole bunch of the janissaries who are like, no, we don't want to get conscripted. And they basically ask their consuls to object on their behalf, saying, no, this person is a protege by virtue of working for the consulate. And it seems like it works. This is something that is a little bit, the Egyptians from the reign of the administration of Mehmed Ali from the beginning is much more open to the claims of the consuls for extraterritorial protection. So things that would not fly in the Ottoman Empire fly in Ottoman under Mehmed Ali from like 1850 and on. But so that might be part of what's going on. But it is interesting from my perspective to see that you start getting sort of a number of claims in Beirut, even, saying this guy is a janissary for the Sardinian consulate or the French consulate, and he shouldn't be conscripted. You also get a form of more like temporary protection, where you get all of these Muslims who like just run into the consulate. This is the French consulate in Beirut. And the French consul is like, I didn't talk about this, but consuls, another point along the spectrum of legal belonging is that consulates can act as sanctuaries. And if you are physically in the space of the consulate, you have a certain immunity from the jurisdiction of the local authorities, which is I think, a form of legal belonging, even though extremely temporary and tenuous, because the consul can kick you out at any moment. But the consul accepts all of these Muslims into the courtyard of the consulate, and as long as they're there, they're not getting conscripted. In 1849, the Bey of Tunis tries a man named Ali bin Ismail, who is, again, a Mamluk working as a guard for the Sardinian consulate. Ali is accused of blaspheming Islam, and he's tried basically for capital punishment. And here, again, the Sardinian consulate writes to the Bey and says that Ali should be punished in a Sardinian court because he is our protege by virtue of working with the Sardinian consulate. In this case, the Bey refuses, and the Sardinian consul doesn't seem, at least from what I found in the archives, the Sardinian consul doesn't seem to pursue the case. But again, it's raised. And once again, back to the Kharab case, the Maltese murder in 1843, again, it's raised that Yusuf, the Tunisian victim, is working for the British consulate and thus maybe should be under British protection. What I also notice is that increasingly in the 1840s, 1850s, you have European consuls who start framing Ottoman resistance to the protection of Muslims as a religious issue. And I don't know yet to what extent that actually reflects how the Ottoman authorities are thinking about it, or how European consular authorities expect the Ottomans to be thinking about it. Like, you guys, this is such fresh work. I'm telling you, I have more questions than answers, but to me, this is really an open question. So in 1853, there's a report by French dragoman Antoine Joseph de Corroy, who spent years as the sort of chief dragoman in the embassy in Istanbul, who suggests that the Ottoman government, quote, could never agree to the possibility of a Muslim who wanted to put himself under foreign protection. Interestingly, de Corroy says the capitulations are totally mute on this point. There is no precedent. There isn't a history. There isn't a kind of customary practice that we can draw on, because a lot of the law, the normative sources around the practice of extraterritoriality don't come from the text of the capitulations, but actually from what is just done. And he says there that we don't have any sources. We don't know what's going on. And basically he says, yeah, no, we haven't really thought about this, we being the French or other Europeans, and the Ottomans haven't really thought about this. Like, this isn't something that there's a whole lot of thought about. There is no question that Ottoman authorities were upset by efforts to protect Muslims. Again, Lale-Jan's work is incredibly clear on the subject, that there is a kind of sense of sovereignty over even foreign Muslims that gets activated, especially later in the 19th century. Salma Hargal's work is also very clear that Ottoman authorities really objected to the idea that Algerian Muslims who had emigrated to the Ottoman Empire should then claim French protection. However, what she also shows, which I think is perhaps even more significant than the fact that these people are Muslim, is that these Algerians benefit enormously from the status of muhajir. They get all the same privileges that we hear later about Circassians and people coming from other former Ottoman territories back, Muslims coming from other former Ottoman territories back into the Ottoman Empire, or into the what is still the Ottoman Empire, and they get fiscal privileges, exemption from taxes, exemption from conscription. They often get given land. The Algerians are much smaller in number than, say, the Circassians, much smaller, right? You have you have thousands in Ottoman Syria, but thousands, not hundreds of thousands. Still, they're there, and it's not clear to me. What's clear to me is that the Ottomans are very upset when those Algerians tried then to claim French protection, or when the French consulate, by the way, they're so deviant. The French consuls send people out to these communities and to basically try to say, hey, don't you want to be a French protege? Don't you want to register your name as a French subject? But it seems like it's probably more about the fact that the Ottoman state has given them these enormous privileges. And then when they expire, instead of agreeing to be conscripted, they're like, oh, well, no, I'll just say that I'm a French subject, right? Which, if I were an authority, I would be pissed at that too. And in 1853, also the same year that this report gets written by Corroy, there's a kind of, a sort of report by the French authorities who say that the Ottomans are objecting to these Algerians claiming French status on religious grounds. And it says fanaticism rears its head. The consul claims that when he was talking to his counterpart, fanaticism reared its head. He, the Ottoman official, told me that he might allow, actually, I think he's talking to the Grand Vizier. Sorry, I think this is the ambassador talking. I should have written this down. I think this is the ambassador talking to the Grand Vizier saying he might allow me to protect Jews, but Turks under French protection, never. Now, again, it is clear that the Ottomans are a lot less concerned about the Algerian Jews who get French protection. And the French are much more effective in Syria in particular at protecting Jews. And there are certain places where it's not clear to me how much it's self-selecting, but in once the French send a consul to Jerusalem, one of his big claims to fame is that he protects a few hundred Algerian Jews, because there aren't any Frenchmen in Jerusalem, or very few Frenchmen. And the Catholics were there very unruly, like they were in Chios in the 18th century. They continue to be a problem. So the Algerian Jews he tends to like more, because they're just really, really grateful to the French for protecting them, and tend to stay quiet, with some exceptions. Sometimes they get in trouble. Like one guy seduces a Muslim woman, and French consul's like, what are you thinking, this idiot? Anyway. And he gets rid of him. He's like, yeah, no, you're not a French protege anymore. But it's not just Jerusalem, right? Beirut, the consul in Beirut, the consul in Smyrna, in Izmir, these consuls in Greater Syria are regularly protecting Jews in a way that they're not regularly protecting Algerian Muslims. Eventually, and this I think is really much later, but and dovetails with the kind of sources that Lale John sees for Central Asians, eventually there seems to be something of a kind of systematization that foreign Muslims are under the protection of the caliphate, of the Islamic caliphate. And so there's correspondence about Moroccans that says, yeah, Moroccans are under the caliph, the protection of the caliphate, and thus are kind of like Ottomans when they come to the Ottoman Empire, and shouldn't be considered foreign. They shouldn't get foreign protection. Afghans, et cetera, et cetera. And then again, we see that Moroccan Jews regularly succeed in claiming foreign protection. And there's a whole set of correspondence about Spanish claims to protect Moroccan Jews, which supposedly is based on some sort of treaty between Spain and Morocco, which, as far as I know, doesn't exist. A treaty allowing the Spanish to protect Moroccan Jews in the Ottoman Empire. I've never found any evidence of the existence of that treaty, but apparently somebody was claiming it. And again, the Ottoman authorities are a little bit like, what's going on here? And they look into it, but they're not stridently objecting, and there's no sense of, foreign Jews from other Islamic territories are under any kind of automatic protection of the Ottoman Sultan. And again, I was saying earlier that the looseness of the rules around extraterritoriality are even more pronounced in Ottoman Egypt. And in Ottoman Egypt, you get hundreds of these sort of attestations in the Spanish consular archives, these attestations saying that this Jew is under Spanish protection. Not there. There's no reference of any kind of treaty between the Moroccan Sultan, because they're not only Moroccan Jews, they're from all over the place. Some of them are from Morocco, some of them are from Salonika. One is clearly an Ashkenazi Jew from Romania who somehow like convinced them that he's like his name is like Goldberg. He's like, yeah, I'm Sephardi. But anyway, they have these attestations and they're kind of they clearly become sort of standardized, and it says that this guy is from the Ahali Ra'ayat al-Hispaniya, the people of the subjects of Spain, and that he belonged to the Jewish sect in Alexandria, so he's Jewish, and by virtue of that, he is under Spanish protection. And again, Egypt is a little different, and the Spanish archives are pretty disorganized, so I don't know. I have to go back. I don't know that such a treasure trove of these sorts of documents exist for other parts of the Ottoman Empire, but once Muhammad Ali takes over in Egypt, there's clearly a very different approach to extraterritoriality. So this is a kind of particularly loose. And I will say that also in Egypt, tons of Algerian Muslims successfully claim foreign protection. So there, again, I don't think it's so clearly divided by religion. Same in Tunisia and Morocco. I won't talk about Morocco today because you're all Ottomanists, but although Morocco's cool and you should read more about it. But Tunisia, it's really there. It's partly it's the proximity to Algeria. There's just so much movement back and forth. Partly it's the kind of weakness of the Bey vis-a-vis consular authorities. But there are thousands and thousands of Algerians, and there again, it becomes very standardized. You get a certificate that says I am an Algerian from X, town in Algeria. And you get tons of correspondence from the Bey, from the administration of the Bey, and from the French consular authorities. Think this guy is not really Algerian, clearly faked it. What do we do? Or claiming that somebody has successfully duped the French, et cetera, et cetera. So honestly, I think there's an enormous amount of questions about how extraterritoriality gets perceived vis-a-vis religion in the 19th century. To me, what's very clear is that there's a change. But I think the more I do research, the later that change seems to be. It gets pushed further and further into the 19th century. So it's certainly not 1839. There's certainly not the early modern, right? Again, in the early modern period, what's amazing is that the subjecthood of Ottoman Jews and Christians is completely unquestioned, right? And very powerful in terms of determining their legal status. So, that I've gone now 5 minutes over what you generously allotted me, which is, so I will end with that not very concluding conclusion, but really to say that I'm so looking forward to thinking this through with you. Of course, if you have questions, I would very much, questions and comments, I would very much appreciate it, but more throughout the day, thinking more broadly about this sort of long history of becoming and unbecoming Ottoman subject. Thank you. Can I just feel, sorry. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Thank you for that amazing talk. I really enjoyed it. What I wanted to say is, for the 18th century, the earlier times, when I was writing Denial of Violence, I realized that the Ottoman historical chronicles have a lot of, they are literally like, Tarihi, Naima, Tarihi, all that series, have a lot of information on things that happened.
Yes.
Because they're basically mostly talking about things that happened in Istanbul. And you can, I was able to get a lot of information there, especially because I was interested in how the protection over the minorities of the empire, Christians, obviously, and Jews, changed over time. But there were lots of instances where they talk about, well, there was this Jewish guy, and then, two people attacked him, and then, how was it negotiated? But you see that there is that legal protection.
Right.
And as Sana Arendt says later, of course, when they become citizens, that disappears. So there is that. Also, in the earlier periods, Christian figures were probably as well as Richard Antaramyan's later, that too contained some information about it. One thing I wanted to, and then there is İlkay Yılmaz and all these others. I mean, but what I was in my own work more interested in is this legal responsibility or legal belonging within the empire of the millets to the sort of Islamic Sharia system. And Mark Baer and I wrote an article on who had which minority, which millet used which court in Istanbul. And we tried to sort of look at Istanbul because those courts were equidistant, and from because they could go to either one.
Right.
And what we found that a lot depended on, of course, what the case was. I mean, if it was an inheritance case, like I was interested in, then they would, depending on who the inheritors were, they would decide.
Yeah.
But the other thing that was also interesting was it also depended on the, in the case of the Jews, the rabbi, and how well he was known. I mean, whether he was a good one or he didn't deliver, laws properly.
Yes.
So that is, as you say, it's a very fluid choice in that context as well. But what I wanted to ask you about was when you said in Malta they took down the churches.
In Chios,
Sorry. Churches. But I was usually the practices, they would just transform them into mosques or use it in any other capacity.
Yeah.
So I was surprised that they would take it down. It would be interesting to see. I mean, when they say take down, do they mean taking down the function of the building as a church versus totally destroying it? So that also, I think, goes into the politics of space, so to speak, and how it converts over time.
That is such,
or do you have any
No, oh God, no, I do not know. That's an excellent question. And, honestly, it's just in the course of writing this talk that I realized I'm going to have to read a lot more about Chios. I mean, I had said, but yes, exactly. So those kinds of questions. The one thing I will say about that, which is a clue, so there's an enormous amount of archival research that I want to do, because I think actually Chios is going to become a kind of case study, because it's so interesting. But what is interesting is, again, the anger at the Catholics didn't come clearly from the Ottoman authorities as much as it came from the Greek Orthodox on Chios, who were clearly gunning. They were basically the Latins sided with the Venetians, give us all their stuff. And the Ottomans were okay. And basically gave there was, I think, even a kind of bid. The Greek Orthodox authorities on the sort of, I guess, bishop on the island basically bid for the right to dispose of all of the Catholic wealth, the church's wealth on the island post-Venetian, post-reconquest from the Venetians. But yes, so I don't know, did they get turned into Orthodox churches? Did they get turned into mosques? Did they get actually raised? I'm not sure. It's a great question. I do think that then later, 25 years later, when the Ottomans were so angry at the building of this illegal building, that I think did get raised. That really was, but I think that was also largely symbolic, because they were you cannot build a new church, right? There was the sticking.
Mostly the tower.
Absolutely, yes. Well, there's this language. They constantly accuse the Catholics of building a fortress. Apparently they built almost a guarded, So anyway, yes. But I'll just say what you were saying earlier about the fluidity of jurisdictions is absolutely 100% part of this story. And this is not what I presented today, but part of this book project is to argue that consular courts, in so much as they were courts in the early modern period, almost seamlessly inserted themselves into this broader legal landscape, such that a protege or even a foreigner could say, I might go to the Sharia court this time, or I might go to the Pasha's divan, or I might go to the consular court, depending on the circumstances of the case, and that wasn't seen as a violation of anything until very late. very, very late. Again, it depends a little bit on which consulate you're looking at, but the consuls expected that. They weren't upset. Sometimes they were like, oh, I got a little grumpy when somebody would go to the Ottoman authorities. But again, it was sort of like, yeah, of course they're going to do that, because we are sort of inserted into this broader landscape. And again, I cannot recommend enough the work of Tamar Herzog on European legal history, which has helped me rethink instead of thinking about that as the transgression of jurisdictions, which is actually how I used to think about it, I think it's actually the lack of firm jurisdictional boundaries at all. There might be sort of vaguely theoretical ones, but on the ground, nobody thought that way. They thought about, is this an inheritance case? Is this rabbi famous enough to kind of hold an authority? Is the pasha a good guy, or is he an asshole and he's going to force me to bribe him to some insane amount, right? So,
But ultimately, in the enactment of whatever the decision is, they turn to the Ottoman authorities because they do not have.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, 100%. Ultimately, the Ottomans are in charge, even for most consular cases.
Delivering the.
Totally agree, 100%. Thank you. Yeah, Gottfried, or.
Okay, thank you. I'm Camille, by the way.
Hi, yeah, we haven't met in person. I enjoyed reading your paper.
So I just wanted to say, generally speaking, I think that your argument is really convincing that this is a form of protection is something that is weaker and only becomes something stronger. And I have a bunch of questions which you might not know the answer to, and maybe they're not that relevant, but I thought it raised a lot of things for me. So one of the things you mentioned was that in the earlier period, consular protection was mainly about fiscal privileges rather than jurisdictional privileges. And I thought that was really striking to me. And I wonder to what extent those things become connected to each other, especially because in my period and in Iraq, most of the people who are, kind of claiming British protection are merchants. And so the question of what are the kinds of privileges that you have? And also I'm thinking as imperialism, particularly informal imperialism or whatever, becomes more and more about free trade and protecting the rights of free traders. And also as free trade becomes a kind of quasi-religious discourse among certain people in Britain, in the Ottoman Empire and in China, to what extent are those things, is the kind of fiscal privilege kind of driving the jurisdictional privilege, if that makes sense. The second thing that I thought was really striking is the kind of the French officials wanting French people trained in languages. And I definitely, it makes sense to me that it would be partly about the ability to project strength. And if you can't protect your proteges, what good are you? But I also wonder if there's a kind of anxiety about knowledge production, because if you think about the British, right, in India, the language schools, the distrust of the native, quote unquote, native informant, do we also see this? And I wonder, okay, so the next thing, sorry. So when we see this kind of, I also thought, so you mentioned that the legal assimilation of the rights and obligations of proteges to those of foreign nationals basically excludes matters of personal status.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
I'm okay, what is that? But I feel like the other place where I've seen a lot about personal status as a different kind of law is in the kind of restriction of quote unquote Islamic law, particularly in British India. And so I wonder if part of what's going on is can we think of those things in parallel? Ottomanness is being restricted to a kind of religious, a kind of this is only for, matters of marriage or whatever. I'm not sure what personal status entails, as a way to claim all of these other things as being not personal, right? So you can belong to the Ottoman Empire in this kind of you like it kind of way, whatever. But in matters, in other more important matters, you are on other things. So I know you said you've mostly been in the French archives. I would be really curious about to what extent you see at what point the British start claiming jurisdiction over Indian Muslims.
Yes, big question.
Because, right, is it as early as the 1820s?
Yeah.
Do you only see it after 1857?
Yeah. No, I know. Big open question for me. I need to figure that out.
Yeah, I just think that would be.
Well, again, so much of the literature is later.
Right, exactly.
And it's nobody really knows. So I think it's just the 1820s is a messy period.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And then I also with that, one thing that I thought was also striking, with you started with the Maltese, and of course, in Will Hanley deals with the Maltese as the quintessential bad subject.
Oh, they're such assholes.
They're so bad.
I can attest.
And they're doing murder, but right, part of the I feel in his work, part of the resistance of the British to protect Maltese is that they're not really British. And so I wonder if there's like, do you also see within empire? I mean, you see this in a later period, like with British Indians and South Africa and stuff like that, whatever. Okay, the last thing that I wanted to say was, okay, no, sorry, two more things. I wonder if thinking about Morocco before, like Moroccan and Ottoman interactions pre-France.
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't do this work exactly, but Pete Kitlis's work. Yeah. Like I wonder if he has thoughts about like other Muslim jurisdictions within the Ottoman Empire before colonialism. And then the very last thing that I just thought of may not be relevant, but there's some really interesting
pen
work.
ran out. Keep
Okay,
talking.
sorry. There's really
Thank you.
interesting work on the question of jurisdiction in colonial conquest and native history in the United States.
Absolutely.
And so I wonder if like if also like the kind of global experience of seizure, the colonial seizure, and like especially obviously it's a very different kind of colonialism, but like that is a kind of laboratory for rethinking jurisdiction.
100%.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much.
These are such great questions, and in the interest of time, I won't answer all of them fully, but I so appreciate you asking them all because they'll help me think. Free trade, yes. I mean, just yes, and they do go together, 100%. Anxiety about knowledge production, absolutely, 100%. And a lot of the, because they don't succeed, and so the Ottoman dragomans, I mean, Natalie Rothman showed about this, they have an enormous amount of power to switch between, and she's shown that, like, especially she works on the Venetians, but the Venetians sometimes pay these guys who don't actually even do any work for them, but they want to keep them on the payroll so they don't get employed by the French or the British. And they're like, actually, it's good that this guy isn't working, translating for us, because if he did, he would sell the secrets of our correspondence with the office. Anyway, yes. And that same thing happens with the French. Personal status, that is a whole, okay, so I simplified a lot, and actually Pellicier de Rosas himself goes on to say, this is the theory that personal status is still under their, religious law, but in fact, it's a giant mess. And it's the one moment in his book where he admits that it's chaos, jurisdictionally, legally, normatively, it's chaos, because always he's trying to like project a sort of, like organization, this has a system, blah, blah, blah, and he admits it's chaos. And indeed, I've looked at some of this in the archives that it's chaos. And I love Picos's work. And I think in general, part of my big project is to say that, and this is, one small thing that I'm trying to do is just to say that everything going on in Morocco is completely connected to the Ottoman Empire. You cannot do the history of extraterritoriality in Morocco without Ottomans. A little bit less vice versa, but when it comes to Algerians, no, because the Algerians in Morocco and Tunisia those are the big numbers. And then finally, this question of global view of colonial jurisdiction is absolutely important. And the way I got onto the 1830s is from Lisa Ford and Lauren Benton's book, Rage for Order, which is only about the British Empire and really about empire. And, and I would say it's less, I don't like to think about, even in the 1830s, I resist thinking about extraterritoriality as a kind of proto-imperial thing, even that late. I mean, even then, but I think it's more actually about the kind of post-Napoleonic, we just got to get our shit in order. We just got to organize how we're administering jurisdiction in general.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm coming from a much earlier period, so
Good.
But and so this is absolutely fascinating. So how does this work? So I'm very tempted to zoom out for a moment and ask about sort of the big picture development here, whether you think it's feasible to frame this whole thing as a process of, say, disambiguation.
Yes.
I've always been sort of drawn to Thomas Bauer's sort of big thesis of the tolerance for ambiguity in pre-modern societies. And it seems to me like for the Ottomans that has worked for a very long time, worked pretty well. And I was intrigued how in so many of your cases, yes, you have sort of an ambiguous legal situation, and then it gets negotiated not according to legal principles, but according to politics of the local power structures, convenience, whatever. Many other factors sort of going into that, and is that what's going on behind that? And is religion, among other things, a useful tool
Because it's unambiguous.
Okay. This is such an interesting question. And I actually think that ambiguity is misleading when it comes to law, because it implies that there should be clarity, but in fact, people tolerate ambiguity. Whereas, again, I've learned so much from reading Tamar Herzog and also Thomas Duve, who is in the Max Planck Institute for Legal History in Frankfurt. They together recently wrote a book about legal history of Latin America. So but so many of their ideas and their ways of approaching the questions of jurisdiction. And I just gave a talk in Frankfurt, and something Thomas Duve said was just, I mean, it really hit me. So one thing is, I would say that the ambiguity model is often the kind of legal pluralism model, that there are these different jurisdictions that are competing, but there's a kind of overlapping. There's a lot of overlap between their jurisdictions, and people are okay.
I guess my question.
So, but Herzog's point is that if you think of that as overlapping or as pluralism, you are already imposing a clarity that did not exist. In fact, what there was cacophony. This is the word that I take from her, that to me I kind of juxtapose with pluralism. There was a cacophony of legal authorities who all could pronounce. So this is, I think, actually very much what is going on in Istanbul. It's not that there's legal pluralism. Actually, it's that there are a number of different jurisdictions, all of whom can claim authority, all of whom can claim the right to jurisdictio, to say the law in a given case. And only in the 19th century do you start having a sense that this is bad, that we need to have a centralized form of jurisdiction that then creates legal pluralism, where you say, okay, the Sharia court is going to do this for Muslims, the rabbinical court is going to do this for Jews, and we're all going to know which case goes to which jurisdiction at every point. And then whatever ambiguity exists, we're going to try to disambiguate as much as possible. But in fact, I think, and Duve said something to me, which also, I'm thinking about still, but his point was that it was always political. Whoever got to say the law, whoever got to actually exercise jurisdiction in any given case, it was about power. It was about how much power you could exercise in a given instance. It was not about rules. And that to say that, so, I mean, you could think about it as ambiguity. I guess what I'm saying is I think the legal historians who are doing the most interesting work are actually resisting that and instead saying that this was the norm. Everybody expected this, and everybody expected it to be a power play. Emmanuel, do you want to respond?
React to cacophony.
Yeah.
I cannot use that word either, because cacophony is even more normative than ambiguity. In the sense that it just sounds bad. Cacophony is bad.
Okay, yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yeah, cacophony sounds like it hurts your ears. Okay, multiplicity. How's that? Okay, yes, fine. Okay, she uses the word cacophony and I find it striking, but sure, multiplicity is good. Yeah,
Okay,
fine.
I didn't have a question about your question.
No. I would not.
I'm amazed by what you did. I think you were responding, and I'm going to be very naive here. I'm a 20th century historian of Turkey, very provincial in the sense, very nationalist in many respects. And what I want to say is that I have a feeling that what you're doing is answering a need I was feeling for a long time, a need for a history of, and that's my question, a history of protection.
Yes.
And I'm asking you, why do you call it a history of extraterritoriality rather than a history of protection?
Yeah.
I have the feeling that you are nurturing and meeting a need.
Yeah.
We need something.
Yeah.
We have new work. We have a lot of words that are very important to understand how we switch from the ancien regime to something where we all have done papers here where the system of capitulation is very imperialist in its final shape. And we're all fighting, and your work also is very significant, or yours, fighting over people and having more people, or Marie Bossard's work. But in fact, what you're doing is precisely building up a bottom-up history by legal practice of protection. So why call it extraterritoriality, which sounds to me both anachronic and not exactly in conformity with what you are studying.
Yeah, no, 100%. And in fact, I had in the first version of my talk a long discourse about, actually, I don't think it's extraterritoriality. My whole book now is the invention of extraterritoriality, which it has invented between 1815 and I would say 1850. So absolutely, 100%. And I cut that out for the sake of time. And I use extraterritoriality in the title for kind of, recognition, like name recognition. People kind of know what that is. I do think it is important in the sense that it does get invented, right? People do start talking about that. And to me, that is the switch from protection, which happens in all these gradations, right? You can protect a Catholic religious, but really you have no authority over them. You're just begging the Grand Vizier to be nice. Like, please don't destroy his church. Like, that would be nice to not destroy his church. Versus protecting a Frenchman, where you get more upset if the Grand Vizier, if a Pasha imprisons a French priest or imprisons a French consul, which does happen too. Consuls get beaten, imprisoned, kicked out, etc. So absolutely, and yes, and to me, actually, the shift that I'm talking about is precisely captured in the invention of extraterritoriality, which of course goes with the invention of territoriality, which also I don't think really exists in the same way in the modern period. Yeah.
This was amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you for providing the backstory of what I'm going to discuss more today. And what you said, like, get me thinking about, like, who was an Ottoman in the early modern era. So, like, I was thinking that maybe being in proximity to the state or being in Istanbul defined, like, who could be an Ottoman. I'm, like, remembering, like, Ataman's work on, like, how, for example, like an Istanbulite Jewish was more Ottoman than a peasant, a Muslim peasant in the periphery empire. So yeah, maybe it would go down. We should do a workshop on early modern subjects with them to combine our interests for the next slide. So my question was, like, building on also what Camille said, can we push more towards like that inter-imperial competition moment in the 19th century? I was thinking together your work with Dale's work and how Muslims became an asset in the 19th century. And can we think together like the French protection of Algerian Muslims together with like British and Russian protection of Central Asian Muslims, for example? Like, could it be a push towards French to protect more Muslims, or am I thinking so much with my late 19th century brain?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I would say that so what you were saying about sort of the early modern version perhaps being about proximity to Istanbul, I think that is part of it, but I also think that there's a kind of inherent layeredness to belonging that, again, people just expect in the early modern period. So, and now I'm drawing a lot of on Yusuf Ben Ismail's work on Tunisia, because he has this amazing work on Tunisians who are in other parts of the Ottoman Empire, especially Istanbul, where there's a big trade in the fez, as in the hat, or the and so and he's kind of talking about the fact that these Tunisians are claimed as subjects of the Bey and as Ottomans. And, yes, in Tunis, they're almost never going to really invoke their status as Ottomans unless it becomes important. So like when when there's a civil war in 1864 and they're worried, okay, we have to, anyway, they ask that they like send letters to the Ottoman, to the Sublime Porte, to the Central Ottoman administration, saying, please, send ships because the French are threatening to bombard and the British are threatening to bombard, and they're worried they're going to get colonized like Algeria, et cetera, et cetera. However, I don't know. I think what's very clear to me is that when the French first start protecting Algerians, that is cacophony. They do not know what they're doing. And this is something that I've traced, like trying to look at the consular correspondence in the 1830 across the Mediterranean. And some of the French consuls are like, okay, these Algerian Muslims and Jews came to me, I'm going to protect them. And some of them are like, no, the Jews are here. But they clearly are like in Beirut, the guy is like very skeptical of the Algerian Jews who come to him because they're like, you all just came to Jerusalem to die. You don't intend to go back to Algeria. Like, what are you talking about? And plus, I don't want to protect you. You're like Oriental, whereas the guy in Smyrna is like, oh yeah, look, all these hundreds of Jews and Muslims. And also I think it has a lot to do with something that I also really need to learn more about, is the system of the wukala, the wakil, who are these sort of representatives, then later get assimilated to diplomats that the Bey of Tunis sends, that the that the Moroccan Sultan sends, that the Algerians also were sending before 1830, and then, what happens to that status after colonization. So I think later there is a much more kind of strategic thinking about, let's get some Muslims on our side, essentially. But what's clear to me is that, again, in 1830, that's not how the French are thinking, and I don't think that's how the British are thinking, again, to this open question about when they start. But, again, the Maltese, however, I will say that I think there is a kind of Europeanness to the Maltese, and I should mention the Ionians, who are also spread over the Ottoman Empire in large numbers and constantly creating trouble as well, just like the Maltese. I think because they are Christian and they are coming from Europe, they're coming from Christian Europe that has been Christian under Christian rule for a very long time. There's a kind of lack of ambiguity to the sense that they're going to be under British protection. Nobody's questioning that. And I think it's for Jews and Muslims who weren't, that poses more of a problem. So anyway.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for these amazing questions. So helpful. Thank you. Thank you.